Every time I see her face, an intense wave of nausea washes over me, as though my entire body is physically rejecting her presence. It's not just her face, the cold, calculating look in her eyes or the way her lips curl into a disdainful sneer that makes my stomach turn. It's the memory of all the harsh words she's flung at me, the way she's belittled me, the relentless emotional toll she's taken. Seeing her now, that familiar sickness wells up inside me, a visceral response to the psychological wound she's inflicted. "Oh dear, that's just dreadful, Sherry," my mother-in-law says, her voice dripping with false sympathy. There's a wicked glint in her eyes that betrays her true feelings. She's enjoying this. Every word is like a carefully sharpened blade, slicing through any remaining shred of dignity I have left. "You should pack your things and leave. What if something happens to Betty's child because of you?" Her tone is sweet, almost sing-song, but the threat beneath it is unmistakable. She's positioning me as a danger, a contaminant that could harm her precious grandchild. I glance over at her, then at my sister-in-law, Betty, who is sitting nearby, smirking with that same malicious satisfaction. They're united in their contempt for me, feeding off each other's cruelty. Their grins widen as they see my reaction, relishing the pain they know they're causing. In that moment, I realize that every effort I've made to fit in, to be the perfect daughter-in-law, has been for nothing. My stomach churns, a toxic mix of anger, sadness, and despair roiling inside me. But I know better than to show weakness in front of them. I force myself to swallow the lump in my throat and respond quietly, "All right, I'll leave. My name is Sherry, and I live with my husband, Ellen, in his family's home, a large, old house that feels more like a prison with each passing day." The walls, once filled with the laughter of a family, now seem to close in on me, trapping me in a life of servitude and isolation. Ellen's father passed away several years ago, leaving his mother, who has mobility issues, to manage the house alone. When Ellen and I decided to get married, we knew that we would be living with her. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement at the time. Before our marriage, his mother appeared to be a kind and gentle woman. She had a soft, almost fragile demeanor, always smiling, her eyes crinkling with warmth whenever she looked at me. I remember how she would thank me for even the smallest things, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, Sherry," she would say, her smile radiant. "You're so helpful." I was naive enough to believe that living with her would be manageable, perhaps even pleasant. I thought that with time, we would grow even closer, and that I would become an integral part of Ellen's family. But that was the biggest mistake of my life. Once Ellen and I were married and began living together in the family home, the sweet, gentle woman I thought I knew began to disappear. Her true colors started to show, and what I saw left me reeling. The warm smiles and kind words were replaced with cold stares and sharp, cutting remarks. She gradually stopped thanking me for anything I did. At first, I didn't think much of it. Gratitude wasn't what I was after. I wanted to be helpful, to contribute to the household. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. It wasn't just that she stopped thanking me, she started to criticize everything I did. "You're so slow," she would snap, her voice harsh and unforgiving. "Ellen will be home soon, and you haven't cleaned the bath or finished dinner. What's going on?" The first time she spoke to me like this, I was stunned. My heart raced as I scrambled to find the words to apologize, to explain. "I'm sorry," I stammered, "Ellen just happened to come home early today, and I'm doing the chores as usual." I tried to smile, to show her that I was on top of things, that there was no need to worry. But she wasn't interested in my explanations. "If your husband comes home early, you should work faster," she retorted, her voice rising with irritation. "You don't care enough about Ellen. That's your problem." The accusation hit me like a slap in the face. I could feel my cheeks burning, not just from embarrassment, but from the sting of her words. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell her that she was wrong, that I cared deeply for Ellen, more than anything. But she cut me off before I could say a word. "I don't want to hear your excuses," she said coldly, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down with disdain. "Poor Ellen. Why did he marry someone like you?" Her words echoed in my mind, each syllable dripping with venom. The kind woman I had known before our marriage was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to take pleasure in tearing me down. Every day became a test, a challenge to see if I could survive her endless criticisms and demands. But I kept going, because Ellen was my anchor. He was the one person who made it all bearable. In front of Ellen, my mother-in-law played the role of the perfect matriarch, kind, considerate, and supportive. She would smile at me, praise me for my efforts, and act as though we had a wonderful relationship. Ellen, of course, believed her act. Why wouldn't he? She was his mother, after all, and he loved her. But when Ellen wasn't around, her mask would slip. She would revert to her true self, treating me with disdain and barely concealed contempt. The contrast was jarring, and it left me feeling confused and alone. I confided in Ellen, telling him about the way she treated me when he wasn't around. At first, he seemed skeptical, but when he saw how distressed I was, he believed me. "I'll talk to Mom," he promised, his brow furrowed with concern. And he did. The next day, I noticed a change in her behavior. She was more polite, less critical, and even thanked me a few times. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that things might get better. But it didn't last. A few days later, she was back to her old ways, as though nothing had happened. This cycle continued over and over, wearing me down bit by bit, until I was barely holding on. Then, one day, the phone rang. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard her voice from the next room. It was loud and cheerful, with a tone she only used when she was gossiping. I paused, my hands trembling slightly as I strained to listen. It was Betty on the other end. I could hear her voice, shrill and mocking, as she badmouthed me to my mother-in-law. Betty had once been friendly toward me. I remember when she told me, "I never thought my brother would marry someone as wonderful as you." But those days were long gone. Now, every week, she and my mother-in-law bonded over their shared dislike for me. I could hear Betty's harsh words, slicing through the air like daggers. "You're always causing trouble for Mom. You're so useless," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. I felt numb, the words bouncing off me without leaving a mark. I had grown used to it, the constant stream of insults and criticisms. But after my mother-in-law hung up, she called out to me, her voice bright and cheerful, as though she was about to deliver good news. "Sherry, guess what? Betty is getting a divorce," she announced, her eyes gleaming with excitement. I could barely process what she was saying. Her husband was a plain guy anyway, so it's for the best. She's going to come back here for the birth, and once the baby is born, she'll stay here with us. Isn't that wonderful? I felt my heart drop into my stomach. "What?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, I can't wait," she continued, oblivious to my reaction. "Make sure you prepare a feast for the day Betty comes home. We'll have a celebration." Her grin widened as she looked at me, waiting for me to respond. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Until now, it had been mother-in-law versus me, a relentless battle that had left me exhausted and emotionally drained. But with Betty moving in, it would be mother-in-law and Betty against me, a tag team of cruelty that I wasn't sure I could survive. I was already worn down by my mother-in-law's constant complaints, her biting remarks, and the endless stream of tasks she piled onto me. The thought of Betty joining in, adding her own criticisms and demands, was more than I could bear. I tried to keep my composure, to not let the despair show on my face, but inside, I was falling apart, piece by piece. As I vacuumed the living room, the monotonous hum of the machine filled the room, but it couldn't drown out the weight of the despair that pressed down on me. The house was quiet, but inside, I was anything but calm. I felt like I was suffocating, each breath more difficult than the last. Tears welled up in my eyes, and despite my efforts to hold them back, they began to spill over, silently trailing down my cheeks. I didn't sob or make a sound, just stood there with the vacuum in my hand, feeling utterly defeated. I didn't notice my mother-in-law standing in the doorway until I turned slightly, startled by her presence. Her expression was cold, unreadable, as she watched me cry. For a moment, I thought she might say something, offer some small comfort, but she just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, alone with my tears and the vacuum still whirring uselessly in the background. The silence she left in her wake was deafening, and it only deepened the ache inside me. A few days later, Betty arrived. Heavily pregnant and visibly uncomfortable, she waddled through the front door, her hand resting on her protruding belly as if to support the weight of her unborn child. She was in her 9th month, and every step seemed to require immense effort. Despite this, her expression was one of irritation rather than exhaustion. I greeted her with a soft, "Hello, Betty," trying to muster up some warmth, but she barely looked at me, her face pinched in disdain. Instead of responding, she immediately began to complain, about the long drive, the weather, the state of the house. Her voice was sharp, each word laced with bitterness, as if everything around her was a personal affront. I offered to take her bags, which she allowed without a word of thanks. The bags were heavy, but I didn't mind the physical weight, it was the emotional weight of her presence that crushed me. As I carried them up the stairs to the guest room where she'd be staying, I could hear her voice drifting up from the living room, loud and judgmental. "Sherry really does have a plain face, doesn't she?" Betty's voice was loud enough for me to hear every word clearly. The insult stung, but I bit my lip, refusing to let it show. I had barely made it back down to the kitchen when her voice echoed through the house again. "Oh, I can't stand it. Just looking at Sherry makes me feel sick." There was a pause, and then my mother-in-law's laughter rang out, cold and cruel. "Oh dear, that's terrible," she said, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. Sherry, pack your things and leave. What if something happens to Betty's child because of you? Betty's laughter joined her mother's, both of them reveling in their shared contempt for me. My heart sank further with each word, each cruel laugh. I had spent so long trying to please my mother-in-law, trying to be the daughter-in-law she would approve of, but it was never enough. It seemed like it never would be. The weight of their words pressed down on me, and I felt something inside me break, a final thread snapping after being pulled too tight for too long. I stood in the kitchen, the warmth of the kettle I was holding doing nothing to thaw the coldness that had settled in my chest. I sighed deeply, feeling utterly defeated. "All right, I'll leave," I said softly, the words barely more than a whisper. From the moment I heard that Betty was returning, I had known that this day would come. I had seen it coming like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and inescapable. I had already packed my bags days ago, preparing for the moment when I would have to leave. I had always known that I would leave this house one day, either in a fit of anger or in the depths of despair. Today, it seemed, it was despair. Without another word, I went upstairs, retrieved my bags, and made my way to the front door. My movements were automatic, as if I were on autopilot, my mind numb to everything but the need to get out of that house. I grabbed my car keys from the small table near the door, the cold metal heavy in my hand. As I reached for the doorknob, I heard my mother-in-law's voice call out from behind me, her tone casual, as if she were discussing something as trivial as the weather. "Oh, Sherry, are you really leaving?" she asked, her voice laced with indifference. "That's fine, but make sure you divorce Ellen. He deserves someone much better." I paused, the door half open, her words hanging in the air like a final blow. Slowly, I turned to face her, my expression calm despite the storm raging inside me. "That's for Ellen to decide," I replied, my voice steady. "Thank you for everything." Without waiting for a response, I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with a finality that felt like the end of a chapter. The cool evening air hit my face, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. I took a deep breath, feeling a slight sense of relief as I walked to my car. Once inside, I took a moment to compose myself before picking up my phone to call my parents. My hands trembled as I dialed their number, and when they answered, I felt the dam inside me break. I told them everything, my voice shaking as I recounted the cruel words, the constant rejection, and the final demand that I leave. My parents were furious. I could hear the anger in their voices, but more than that, I heard their love and concern for me. "You don't need to go back to that house," they said, their voices firm. "Come home. We'll take care of you." Their words wrapped around me like a warm blanket, comforting me in a way I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled, a real, genuine smile. That evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Ellen standing there, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes dark with the weight of everything that had happened. "Welcome home, Ellen," I said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Thanks," he replied, his voice tired but filled with relief. "Living with your parents will be a bit nerve-wracking." "Don't worry," I said, leading him into the living room where my parents were waiting. "You'll get used to it quickly. I guarantee it." The first thing Ellen did was apologize to my parents. He stood before them, head bowed slightly, as he expressed his regret for everything that had happened, for the pain his family had caused me. My parents, who had always seen Ellen as a good man, waved off his apology. "There's nothing to apologize for," they said, their voices kind. "You've done everything you could to protect Sherry. We're just glad you're here." Ellen fit in with my parents so easily, it was as if he had always been a part of our family. As we sat down to a meal my mother had prepared to celebrate our arrival, the tension in Ellen's shoulders seemed to ease. We talked and laughed, the warmth of the food and the company filling the room with a sense of comfort I hadn't felt in a long time. But just as we were settling in for the evening, my phone rang. I picked it up, expecting it to be a service provider or maybe a friend checking in, but when I answered, I was met with a voice I hadn't expected to hear. It was my mother-in-law, her tone sharp with panic. "Sherry, Ellen hasn't come home yet," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's already late. Do you know where he is? I've tried calling him, but he's not answering. I'm worried something's happened." I looked over at Ellen, who was sitting beside me, his expression calm. "Oh, Ellen's right here," I said, my voice even. "It seems he's blocked your number." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by a confused, almost disbelieving, voice. "What do you mean? Is Ellen with you?" "Yes," I replied. "We're married, after all." "Send Ellen back immediately," she demanded, her voice rising. "Didn't you say you divorced him?" "Ellen doesn't want a divorce, and neither do I," I said, my tone steady. "This is a matter between a husband and wife, not something for a mother-in-law to dictate." Suddenly, I heard a sob from the other end of the line. My mother-in-law's voice cracked as she started to cry. Why? Why? She wailed, her tears evident even through the phone. Unable to bear hearing her mother cry, Betty grabbed the phone and spoke into it, her words dripping with venom. So, you've stolen my brother, she spat. You're the worst. I haven't stolen anyone, I replied, my voice calm. Ellen and I are married. You might have a plain face, but you're so audacious, Betty sneered. One day, my brother will see the truth, and you'll regret it. With that, the line went dead. I sat there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, as disbelief washed over me. I turned to Ellen, who had been